Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about benchmarking rates and financial performance for water and wastewater utilities in Georgia. I'll introduce the session, but before we do that, I just want to give you a quick tour of GoToWebinar. We're going to be using the chat feature here, the questions feature here to address any questions that you have. So please make sure that you're muted. Hopefully you all can hear the audio right now. There's some instructions at the bottom if you can't hear. Obviously, you won't be hearing me saying that. But please make sure that you mute yourself throughout the session. We're not going to be taking questions by audio. We will be looking at questions through the questions box. So if you do have any questions at any point, please open up the questions and put it in there. Keep in mind that we'll be queuing up those questions to answer them towards the end of this webinar. So I might not get to them right away, but your question will be submitted and we'll go through those at the very end. But I encourage you to answer or to submit your questions at any point. The other thing to keep in mind too is that we have, actually I don't have it showing up on the slide here, but if you open up the control panel, there's a handouts section. If you open up the handout section right now, you could download a copy of the PowerPoint slides right now. You will be receiving an email in about an hour after the webinar is over that provides a link to the webpage where you'll find the, hopefully eventually you'll find the recording of this webinar as well as the PowerPoint slides. Those will be posted before the end of the week. So you'll be able to download those and view the recording. But if you would like to download the PDF right now of the PowerPoint slides, please click on handouts and open up that PDF file. My name is Shadi Eskaf. I'm a research director with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And our center is within the UNC School of Government, and our focus is really on helping local governments as well as non-governmental systems that provide environmental services like water and wastewater, stormwater, address how to finance and how to manage those systems in fair, effective, and financially sustainable ways. And we do that through applied research, through advising, through teaching, through policy analysis. The vast majority of our work is really one-on-one with utilities, with local governments, with state agencies that provide environmental services to address the issues of or questions of financial management of environmental services. We've partnered with GEFA, the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority, over the past several years to do a rate survey. And GEFA, these webinars, including today's, is covered under GEFA's funding. I'm going to be introducing in just a couple of minutes Amanda Carroll from GEFA, and Amanda will go into a little bit about what GEFA is and does and what this partnership is about. My contact information is here. Again, slides will be available, they are available for you right now. They will be available for you later on as well to download. Feel free to contact me at any point if you have any questions after this webinar, if you'd like to follow up. And then just so that we can get started to understand who's in the room, I'd like to launch a poll that just asks you to identify what kind of organization do you represent or do you work for? Are you a local government water wastewater utility? Are you a non-governmental utility? Do you work for GEFA or a technical assistance provider or consultants or something else? And that just gives us an idea of who's in the room and who we're addressing. Okay, we'll just give you a few more seconds to address that. Okay, that sounds good. I'm gonna close this now and just let you, I don't even need to show you the results. I'll just let you know that almost everybody said that you were with a local government water wastewater utility, and perhaps one or two of you are either with a GEFA or a state or federal agency. So thank you for joining. And it looks like the vast majority here are utilities for local governments, and that's great. This is actually one of 3 webinars that we're doing. And they're all back-to-back. So today, tomorrow, and on Thursday, we have 3 sessions. They're all independent, but they kind of feed into each other. Today's session is going to be focused on benchmarking rates and financial performance. So when you're sitting down to think about rates going forward and setting your budgets for next year's for your enterprise fund, what does it mean, and how do you assess whether or not your enterprise fund is financially sustainable and is performing well, and how do your rates compare to other utilities rates as well? So we'll be talking about how to do that in an appropriate manner. Tomorrow there's going to be a session that's going to be focused on setting rates, and specifically to fund not just operations, but also to think about capital improvement and how do you set rates to pay for capital projects going forward. And my colleague Elsa Marie Mullins will be performing or presenting that webinar. And on Thursday, there's one going focused on communicating with elected officials and customers about your rates or the need to have a rate increase. If you're proposing a rate increase, how do you talk to the governing body? How do you make a rate case, and how do you communicate your needs effectively with your elected officials, and how do you communicate with your customers what you're doing with those rates and why you need them? For credit hours, we've submitted each one of these webinars as an independent webinar to the board for approval, where it's still pending, but we will be following up with attendees towards the end of the month once we hear back from the board with instructions about how to claim the credit hours for each of these webinars. So I apologize, I don't have information about that right now, but I'll be sharing that at the very end of this month once we have some more information. But we will definitely be sending out emails to take a look at that. I'm going to stop my webcam right now just because I'm getting a lot of messages about poor bandwidth, and hopefully this will facilitate that. Thank you. All right, so the agenda for today, we're going to be talking, first we're going to have a welcome remarks from Amanda Carroll from GEFA, and then we're going to focus on benchmarking financial performance and setting targets for financially managing your enterprise funds. Then we'll talk about benchmarking rates and how do you compare your rates effectively. And we'll have a demonstration of the Georgia Water and Wastewater Rates dashboard, and we'll talk about some of the ins and outs of that dashboard. And then we'll have some time at the end to address some questions that you might have, and also talk about some resources available for small water systems. Again, at any point you have questions, please submit them into the questions box, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the day. So with that, I'd like to welcome and introduce Amanda Carroll, who is the Senior Project Manager at the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority. Amanda, welcome.
Thanks, Shadi. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Shadi said, my name is Amanda Carroll, and I want to welcome everyone to this webinar series. I'm with the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority. GEFA provides low-interest loans to municipalities to construct water and sewer infrastructure. As Shadi said earlier, GEFA has contracted with the Environmental Finance Center to perform rate surveys, manage the rates dashboard, and provide technical support to local governments on rate setting. Excuse me. For this webinar series, not only will the Environmental Finance Center show us how to use the dashboard and how to set rates to fund operations and capital improvements, but I have also asked them to give ways on how to effectively communicate the need for those rates to elected officials and to the customers. You can go through this exercise on, effectively setting the rates, what's needed in order to fund your capital improvements. But if there's not that communication to the public and the customers, and you do not get that buy-in, it's really kind of hard to get things accomplished. And I just want to welcome everyone to the webinar series, and glad that y'all have decided to join us.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I also want to thank everybody who originally had hoped that we would do an in-person training. So our original plan was to do an in-person training back in April, I believe, in Georgia. And unfortunately with COVID, those plans had to change, of course, and we went to the virtual option. So thank you for everybody's flexibility in adjusting to that. Okay, so let's start talking about benchmarking financial performance. And I like to do polls, just not just because I'd like to, find out more about you, but also to learn about some of the practices that you all do and address some of those. And also to remind you, if you are looking for credit hours, I think one of the things that you need to do is show us that you're interacting during the webinar and that you're paying attention. So polls are a way for us to track those. So please respond to each of the polls that will come up throughout the session. But for this poll, I'd like to know just in general, how do you determine whether or not your water utility or your enterprise fund is financially sustainable? And you can choose all that apply here. So do you do it by comparing your rates to other utilities? Is that one of the metrics that identifies financial sustainability for you? Do you determine whether or not if you win grants, that's a sign that your enterprise fund will now be financially sustainable? And if you don't win grants, then maybe not so much. So, that winning the grant might be the indicator for your enterprise fund. Do you use something else, or do you look at your budget? And if you're keeping to your budget and if your expenses don't exceed what's in your budget, then that's a good sign, and that's how you measure sustainability. Or do you look at your audited financial statements each year to assess financial performance? Okay, we'll give you a few more seconds. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. And for this poll, I'd like for you to participate, but just to kind of get a sense of what's happening right now, at least with the folks on this in this webinar. All right, thank you. Let me close and share the results. So many of you have said, obviously multiple things. It's not one particular metric, but the most common, a lot of you are looking at your yearly audited financial statements. And a lot of you are also looking at your budget and whether or not you're keeping to your budget, and then comparing your rates. Now, as far as how well you keep to your budget, obviously that's a very important metric and a very important process for you to go through and make sure that your expenses don't far exceed what you had budgeted. I will caution for some communities that we know that look at just their budgets, and if they meet their budgets, then that's that gives them the comfort that they're looking for to determine, in determining that your enterprise fund is financially sustainable. I would say that that's only going to be true if your budget is absolutely comprehensive of everything that you need to include in it, which means that your budget should not only include the costs that you have for personnel, supplies, energy, utilities, the things that you need for day-to-day expenses, but also you need to be budgeting for all the capital improvements that are going to be coming down the line in the future as well. And if you don't have projects next year, you should still be budgeting a portion of, or you should be including in your budget some portion to create a reserve to be able to pay for future capital expenses. And we'll cover some of that in tomorrow's session. So I just wanted to bring that up, that a budget is a really good tool to track financial performance, but it's not going to be the only one that would tell you whether or not you're financially sustainable, because it's only as good as your budget, essentially. And comparing your rates, we do know that some utilities like to compare rates, and obviously a lot of you here do that. But as far as using it as a way to assess whether or not your system is financially sustainable, I would say that's you have to be a little bit cautious about doing that, because how your rates compare to your neighboring utilities rates, or how your rates compare to other utilities in the state, doesn't really tell you how well your system, your enterprise fund is going to operate, and how well you're able to manage the finances for your enterprise funds. So your rates might be higher or lower than your neighbors, but that doesn't really say anything about whether or not the revenues and the expenses that you have are going to be sufficient for all the activities that you need to have at your utility. Your utilities costs are going to be very, very different than your neighboring utilities or other utilities. So just keep that one in mind too. So thank you everybody for responding to that poll. And that kind of gets us started on the topic of assessing financial performance. And here are some of the questions that you might be asking yourselves, or the finance director or the utility manager needs to be considering. Is the utility financially self-sufficient? This might be a question that you might even get from your governing board as well. Are you able to cover your debt service payments after paying for day-to-day operations? So for those of you that do have debt, you know very well that your debtors are going to be asking for the principal and interest payments every year. Do you have enough coming in to pay for operations, maintenance, and principal interest? These are things that you're paying for directly in cash every year. And absolutely, you need to be generating enough revenues to cover at least these three things. And then what about situations where you might still have cash flow issues? So what happens if your customers stop paying their bills or get behind on their bills? How long can you continue to operate and pay for your expenses before you run into a cash problem? And that's actually, it's evident, or it's a good thing to bring up, especially these days, because during the pandemic period, we've seen with changes in customer behavior and customer water use, a lot of folks end up having to stay at home or work from home, and a lot of businesses and a lot of commercial industries either reduced operations or completely shut down for at least a portion of time. Well, if you're a utility that's providing water service to residential as well as commercial sector, if your commercial customers are shutting down and not using quite as much water, and your residential customers are at home using more water, their bills are going up, but you're not shutting them off, for example, or they're just getting, they're increasing their, the number of customers who are being delinquent on their bills, then all of a sudden as a utility, your revenues are declining. You're losing some of the revenue from commercial customers that are no longer using the water, and some of the residential customers might be behind in paying their bills, so you're not able to collect on those bills. So that's a revenue reduction problem. And a lot of utilities might panic about that, knowing that your revenues are going down. But if you have enough reserves to cover these short-term reductions in revenues, then you're in good shape to be able to weather those cash flow fluctuations. And there's a metric actually that can help you assess whether or not you're in good condition, how long you continue to pay for operations, even with reduced revenues. And the last one is, can your system meet its short-term obligations? Do you have enough cash liquidity that would enable you to pay for all the short-term liabilities that are due? So you definitely want to make sure that you have enough cash available to pay for your liabilities at any point in time. And there are some key performance metrics that you could calculate from your audited statements that addresses each one of these questions. And I'll go through each one of these to explain them and how to calculate them and get that information. And these are just 4 of many different types of metrics. We can talk a lot about financial performance indicators. We work a lot with local governments in assessing financial performance. And I know that there's not going to be one metric that will tell you whether or not your system is entirely self-sufficient, because there are so many different things you need to consider. Like these 4 metrics right here address 4 different things. There are additional metrics that you could also compute, and I'm happy to talk about some of those either today in your questions or afterwards too, if you want to follow up. And we're happy to talk to you about some more metrics too. And to give you another tool, another resource that you could look at, we've created a few years ago a whiteboard video that explains financial benchmarking in very simple terms. Actually, let me see if I can switch my screen, and I'm sharing with you just kind of a screenshot of this video. It's a 10-minute video that explains financial performance metrics in terms of a guy who owns a car and making sure that he has enough money to run that car and to be able to pay for a replacement when the car wears down over time. So it's a very simple video that's meant to communicate to customers, to governing bodies, and as well as to utility staff, different kinds of financial performance metrics and what they mean and how you calculate them, and tries to put them into a very simple analogy that you could use in communicating with your board. So this is a tool that's available for you in case you want to use it. And when you receive the link to the PowerPoint slides, or if you download the PDF, then obviously you can click on any of these links and use them. I don't have time today to go through the video, so I'm going to just explain the metrics directly. So where do you find the data to calculate all of these metrics? And all of you here are with local governments, so that's great. It's an easy answer. Check your audited financial statements. So every year you have to create a financial statement that looks something similar to what you see on the right here, following GASB rules. And you also submit some of that data to the Department of Community Affairs. You're collecting all of that data at least once a year at the end of the fiscal year. We know sometimes some utilities, don't really look at or use the audited financial statements quite in a way to try to glean out of it some key performance indicators and to track financial performance. In some utilities, the audited statement is something that needs to be done, and they have their accountants and their auditors doing it, and they submit it where they need to submit it, and that's it. That's the end of the story there. But for a lot of utilities that are a little bit more proactive, will actually use the data that's being collected and reported in these statements to track performance over time. And I'll show you examples of how to do that here. If you're working with non-governmental systems, they don't do financial statements the same way that local governments do. They don't follow GASB rules, but they also have something equivalent like balance sheets or shareholder reports or annual reports that they submit to the Utilities Commission or Public Service Commission. Just to know how quickly I should go through audited statements, I'd like to know how familiar you are with your audited financial statements. So are you very familiar? You've actually worked on them, you know very well what's in them. Are you somewhat familiar? Are you you've seen them, you know about them, but you haven't actually used them yourselves, or this might be your first time actually looking at financial statements. And even if you don't work for a utility, if you're working for a state agency, please answer this question if you can, just to get a sense of, again, in the audience, how familiar you are with audited statements. It looks like we have the majority of responses. I'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, thank you. So the majority of you say you're very familiar, and that's great. And then another almost half of you are either seen them and haven't used them, or you're somewhat familiar. So it's a split between those of you that are very familiar and those of you who aren't. I'm going to go through a little bit about the financial statements and explain, especially for those of you who are not quite as familiar, what's in them and what you could use in order to calculate these financial performance metrics. So I'll go in a little bit of detail, but not quite so much. And if you have some follow-up questions, please submit them, and I'm happy to respond as well. But generally, in audited financial statements, you'll have a lot of different things included in them. There are 3 particular statements that you should be looking for in order to compute the financial performance indicators that I'll be talking about. That's a statement of net position, statement of revenues and expenses and changes in net position, and statement of cash flows. So with these 3 statements, you'll be able to compute some of these metrics. Now, you always follow up the statements with a notes section, and the notes section can be very helpful in understanding some of the nuances behind some of the numbers. So in some cases, you might be able to use these statements, compute the metrics following the formulas that we'll be showing here, but some of the results might look confusing or very surprising to you. And if that's the case, I would say take a look at the notes section, because they might explain how some of the numbers that are being reported in the statements might be a little bit different than what you were expecting. You might have to adjust your calculation to accommodate how the data was reported. So let's start with operating ratio, which is the one that's most common. It's actually the one that's on the dashboard that we'll be presenting in a few minutes. The operating ratio is taking your total operating revenues and dividing it by total operating expenses. Total operating revenues for water and wastewater enterprise funds typically means your water and sewer charges, your rates, your late fees, your penalties, your connection fees or your tap fees, anything that all the rates and fees and penalties and charges that you charge your customers directly. That all goes into operating revenues. Your total operating expenses includes all the expenses that you have, all the expenditures that you have, for operations and maintenance. So your supplies, your personnel, overtime, if you're paying taxes or insurance, all those day-to-day expenses or year-to-year expenses are included in operating expenses. And it also includes depreciation. Now, what total operating expenses does not include would be things like debt service costs, as well as any kind of, well, if you're building up reserves for future capital projects. So for future capital expenses that you're not expending this year is not being included in your total operating expenses. If you look at this ratio here, obviously, hopefully you all know that you want to make sure that your operating revenues exceed your operating expenses in any given year. So you want a ratio of at least 1.0. You can calculate this ratio two different ways. One is where you just take a look at total operating revenues and divide it by total operating expenses. The other is where you take out the depreciation number from that denominator. And that actually changes the definition of the operating ratio. The very first one, the one where you're including depreciation into your expenses, what you're trying to calculate here is whether or not in a fiscal year you had enough revenues coming in to pay for your operations and maintenance, and also put aside some money for replacement of assets that are depreciating in value and depreciating in physical condition. If you exclude depreciation from this calculation, you're only asking whether or not the revenues coming in were enough to pay for your operations and maintenance costs. That's it. Now, those are two very important and very different metrics. So let me go through calculation of one of them. This is coming from the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net. Should be net position. This is an older version. And typically you would see you have the operating revenues at the top and operating expenses, and you'll have a line that says total operating revenues and a line that says total operating expenses. You take the first, divide it by the second, and you come up with a ratio. So for this example, a town of Mayberry, which is not a town in Georgia, found, they had $444,000 in operating revenues, and they had $511,000 in operating expenses. So their ratio is actually less than 1.0, which automatically indicates that the revenues that they collected in that 1 year was not enough to pay for personnel, contractual services, supplies, so all their O&M expenses, and for depreciation. If you exclude depreciation, then before you calculate that denominator, you need to take that depreciation line item and you subtract it out of the total operating expenses. So you have your operating expenses of $511,000, you take out the $142,000 of depreciation. So now what you're showing is just the expenses that you have for personnel services, contractual services, and other supplies and expenses. It's just the O&M. You put that into the denominator and you calculate the ratio, and their ratio is 1.2, which is better. That means that the revenues coming in was enough to cover their operations and maintenance. A lot of utilities will find that that's the case. This example of one ratio showing to be above 1.0 and the other ratio being a little bit less, partly because a lot of utilities don't budget for depreciation. You don't have a budget that says, I want to make sure that we have enough revenues that will replace the depreciation for our year. We generate the revenues that we need to save for depreciation, because you don't write a check for depreciation. And we'll talk a lot about that tomorrow as far as how do you pay for capital project. One thing, in case you don't join us tomorrow, I'll just mention that if your utility is budgeting for future expenses and you have a capital improvement plan and you know very well what your comprehensive needs are going forward, then yes, you should be budgeting for operations and maintenance and for all the capital expenses that you're expecting to pay for from your capital improvement plan. So you need to be budgeting for your capital improvement plan as well as your operations and maintenance, and that should be sufficient. If you don't do that, if you don't have an asset management plan, a capital improvement plan, some way to tell you whether, what your comprehensive expenses are going to be going forward for capital projects, then you should at least be trying to budget for depreciation. So that way you're generating enough revenues to save for replacement of some of the assets that you have. And you want to have the operating ratio with depreciation to be above 1.0. I would actually argue that you want to have that ratio be above 1.1 or 1.2. The reason being is that when you're depreciating assets, you're depreciating them on past purchase prices. So that pipe that you laid down 30 years ago and you're depreciating on it, if you try to replace that pipe today, it's going to be more expensive than that replacement value that you're depreciating on. So even when you're meeting your operating and maintenance expenses and your depreciation, it might not be enough to cover the actual replacement of all of your assets going forward. So aiming for higher than 1.0, aiming for maybe 1.1 or 1.2 might be a better target for this operating ratio. And if you're looking for a good ratio for one without depreciation, definitely want to be much higher than 1.0, because this ratio does not include anything at all regarding capital, whether it's debt service or future capital expenses. It's just looking at operations and maintenance, and you want to make sure that you're not just budgeting just for those. You need to be budgeting for capital as well. All right, hopefully that was a preview of some of the things we'll talk about tomorrow, but I just want to make sure we cover that for those of you who might not be joining us. The second metric we'll talk about is debt service coverage ratio. And with that one, it's for those of you that have debt service, you need to be able to generate enough revenues in a year to pay for your operations and maintenance and for your principal and interest payments. Those, again, are the things that you're paying for every year, and the revenues coming in need to exceed that total sum. And the debt service coverage ratio is one that's actually being calculated by the funders, by the debtors. It's a very common metric in the finance world. You take the operating revenues, you take out of it all of the expenses you have for operations and maintenance. So we can approximate that by taking total operating expenses, excluding depreciation, and you divide it by the principal and interest payments. You might think that 1.0 is a good target for this one. You want to have revenues to cover your principal, interest, and O&M costs, but bond covenants and your funding agencies will actually require you to generate a little bit higher ratio than 1.0. It's usually something like 1.1 or 1.2, or maybe a little bit higher too, because the funders want to make sure that you have enough security, that you're generating enough revenues in every year that not just pays for principal, interest, and operations and maintenance, but you're generating some additional revenues as security for other years where you might not be, they might have some revenue reductions. So check your bond covenants and find out exactly what that ratio is, because that is the target that you should be trying to achieve. The data that you need there, well, you've already calculated the first two numbers, the operating expenses and operating revenues. For the denominator, from the statement of cash flows, you'll typically find under the cash flows from capital and related financing activities, the principal and interest payments that you have on debt. And it could either be separated or it could be combined, but find the principal interest payments that you have for your debt service from that statement and put it in the denominator and calculate the ratio. For Mayberry, again, it's not a good picture. The revenues that they collected was not enough to pay for O&M costs and for debt service. So they had to dip into the reserves to pay for their principal and interest that year. Third metric is days cash on hand. This is the one that's giving you an idea of how long you can continue to pay for operations and maintenance while without any additional revenues coming in. So how much reserve do you have that can pay for your operations and maintenance costs at any time? And to calculate that, you need to know what your unrestricted cash and cash equivalents are. What do you have in the bank that's not being designated and restricted for use for some other purpose? So the cash that you have in the bank for the enterprise fund, some of it might be restricted through bond covenants to pay for principal and interest, or to pay, or to reserve the security for your debt. So there are some, or you might even have a capital reserve fund that puts some of the funds aside and reserves them just for capital projects. You can't dip into those restricted funds to pay for operations and maintenance. You can only use them for their specific purposes. So you need to find out from your financial statement, from your accountants, what your unrestricted cash is. That's the cash that you have in the enterprise fund that can pay for anything. And you take that and divide it by an average daily O&M costs, which again is operating expenses excluding depreciation. Divide that by 365 to give you a daily average. And it gives you a ratio that literally is days of cash on hand. It's the number of days that the cash that you have on hand can pay for O&M costs. So this might give you a number that's something like 92. 92 in this case would mean that this utility at the end of that fiscal year had enough cash on hand to pay for 92 days of operations and maintenance just from the reserves. Now, I'd like to know from you what you think might be a good target for this one. So in the past, and for the other metrics, I mentioned that you want to have a 1.0 or 1.2. For this one, for days cash on hand, what's a good target? Should you be looking for a minimum target of 90 days? I want to make sure that we have enough reserves to pay for 90 days of operations and maintenance without any problems, or 30 days is enough. I just need to make sure that we have enough to cover 1 month's worth of billing, essentially. Or is it half a year, or is it, do you want to have a year or 2 years? Now, I can tell you that the credit rating agencies love to see high numbers here. The more reserves you have, the more financially stable your enterprise fund is, and the more that you could weather fluctuations in economic conditions or whatever it is that's affecting your revenues. But it also means that you're sitting on a lot of cash too. So there's usually a trade-off between how much you want to put aside as reserves and how much you want to make sure that you're not charging such high rates that you're generating those reserves and not using those reserves. Okay, so I'm going to close, and this is a completely an opinion piece. Some of you might have a specific number, and or a target, and that's great. But just to share with you, you can see that even from this audience here, there's no one specific target that suits everybody's needs. Some of you say that you want to have at least 90 days, but you don't want to have, you don't need more than that. If you have 90 days of reserves, then that puts you in a good enough position that if there's reductions in revenues, then your reserves can keep you afloat for at least 90 days before revenues come back in. Some of you say you want to have at least a year's worth of reserves. And then most of you said somewhere in between, somewhere like half a year. For those of you who have when you calculate the days cash on hand and you find out that you have, excuse me, thank you for responding, that you have something like 95 or 100 days of cash on hand, think about what's happening with COVID this year. When you had this, the start of, sometime in March and April, starting to see some reductions in revenues, at least on the commercial side. Some of you might have seen an increase overall in revenues because residential bills have gone up, and that's great. Well, great on the finance side of utilities. There are a lot of other issues regarding that. But for some of you who might have lost a substantial amount of revenue from your commercial sector, and you might be on average losing about 10% of your revenue every month. Well, how long, can you continue to weather that pain before your cash starts running out? So if your target was 90 days and you run out of those funds relatively quickly, then it might not have been enough of a security for you to weather a longer term condition like what we're facing these days. So with the current conditions, it's not something that just lasted a month or two. It's something that seems to be kind of going on for a little bit longer. And the longer it goes, there's a lot of questions about how long can we continue to operate, and days cash on hand is a good way to assess that. So to calculate this, what you need is unrestricted cash, and the statement of net assets has that as an item on the it's the first statement, and it's at the very top under the current assets. You usually specify what your unrestricted cash is, or you might have, like this example, cash and then restricted cash. We're just looking for unrestricted cash, which in this case is 107,000, and divided by an average daily O&M cost, they come up with 107 days. So at the end of that fiscal year, they had 107 days worth of cash on hand. I'm going to catch my breath and just mention or remind everybody to please submit your questions as we go along. This is the fourth and the last indicator that I'll talk about on financial performance, but I want to encourage you to submit your questions now so that we can address them towards the end of the webinar. All right, so this metric here is helping to answer the question of do we have enough cash available to be able to pay for our short-term liabilities? Do we have enough liquidity to pay for all the liabilities? And to calculate that, you need your current assets and you divide it by your current liabilities. And those are things that you get from, again, the statement of net position. It looks similar to the other one, but in addition to unrestricted cash, which you have access to, you have some other things too that are current, or that you could also calculate the quick ratio, which looks at assets that you have that you could access relatively quickly and how that relates to your liabilities. So in this case, with current ratio, we're looking at current assets that are not restricted, again, because you need to be able to access those funds to pay for liabilities. So in this case, they only have 3 line items on their current assets. They have cash and they have receivables, and those are things you can access. And then you have your current liabilities, which shows up in the second portion of that same statement, and it's total current liabilities at the very bottom there. So if you divide these two things, you have a ratio of 1.3, which in this case for Maybury, that's a good sign. It means that they have enough current assets available in the bank to pay for liabilities if all those liabilities come due very soon. It's really hard to determine what a good ratio is here. Obviously, you want to always be above 1.0 at any point in time. The difficulty with this ratio, as well as the days cash on hand, is that it changes day to day. The current assets that you have, as well as your current liabilities, will change every day as you get some bills being paid, as some liabilities come due, or you pay off some liabilities. Every single day, this ratio will change. And by looking at your financial statements, you're only looking at it at one point in time, basically at the end of your fiscal year. Where were you with this one ratio? So requiring this one specific target might not be sufficient, because you might meet that target at the end of that fiscal year, but all along the way, every single month, every single day, you should be meeting that same ratio, and that ratio would change day to day. So sometimes we talk about looking at, instead of a 1.0 ratio here, maybe targeting something a little bit higher, something like 2.0, because then that gives you a little bit more security in knowing, well, if at the end of the fiscal year our ratio was 2 or higher than 2, then more likely throughout the year we were at least above 1. So it gives you a little bit more security in trying to generate and try to maintain enough assets to be able to pay for your liabilities throughout the year, not just at the last point in last day of the fiscal year. I'm actually not going to. I don't think I'm going to be talking about this one in detail. I'll mention it. So there's one way to try to assess the physical conditions of your assets through your audited statements, and that's looking at your depreciation values. This one's a little bit tricky because it's not something that's that really matches between the accounting and physical reality. So what I mean by that is when you're looking at depreciation, who sets depreciation values? Who's the ones estimating it? Usually it's either the finance department or the accountants. But when you're talking about the physical asset themselves, things might be physically depreciating at a different rate than how they're being depreciated on paper through the audited statements. So you might say, for example, the accountants might say, we're going to take each pipe and depreciate the asset, each pipe by 50 years. And we're going to assume it's going to be linear depreciation. Every year it depreciates the same amount every year until 50 years down. We'll assume that the whole pipe is basically written off. When you're running systems that each pipe is not the same as the other pipe. Not every one of them will depreciate linearly over time. And definitely it's going to be really hard to estimate how long a pipe will last. So sometimes physical condition might not match financial depreciation. But in order to get just kind of a very easy, very quick assessment of overall, are your assets depreciating faster than you're able to invest in its rehabilitation and recovery, you can calculate that by looking at your accumulated depreciation and dividing it by the gross value of the assets that you have that are depreciable. And if you calculate that, then the ratio goes from 0 to 100. If you're 100%, that means you've completely financially depreciated all of your assets, and that's a really bad sign. And if you're close to 0, then that means that you have a brand new system that you just put into place this year. You haven't even started depreciation. So somewhere in between is where everybody is. And it's really hard to determine what a good benchmark is. Definitely you want it to be lower than higher, but it's 30% or it's 40% good or bad. That's a subjective metric to address. But it's a very, I don't want to say, well, I will say it's almost like a quick and dirty way to assess what how old your assets are, at least from the financial and accountant's point of view. Now you can adjust your depreciation based on physical condition if you want going forward. All right, so we talked about 4 metrics, and I sort of introduced a 5th one. But I want to caution you about not just looking at last year's financial statement. So every one of you can download or take a look at your financial statement last year and calculate these metrics, and you should. But looking at one fiscal year is not going to give you the full picture. And here's an example. So this is not Mayberry, this is some other utility. They calculate their ratios from their financial statement, and they found out that their operating ratio with depreciation was above 1.0, which met their target. So yeah, they're doing fine with operating ratio. Their debt service coverage ratio is 1.15. I don't know if their bond covenants required 1.1 or 1.2, so they may or may not have met their target there. But at least it's high enough that it's not that exceeds 1.1. Their days cash on hand is 145. Their target was at least 90 days, so they met their target. For some of you, that might not be enough, that you might be aiming for 180 days. But in this case, they met the target that they had. And they had the current ratio of 1.2, which again exceeds that 1.0, which was at least their starting point. So overall, they said, all right, based on these metrics, it looks like we're doing fine. We have enough, our enterprise fund seems to be self-sufficient regarding O&M as well as depreciation. We're able to pay our debt service. We have enough reserves to be able to continue to operate if there's reductions in revenues. And we have enough assets to pay for all liabilities. So in general, we're doing fine. But when we assessed their past 5 years that led to this 1 year, this is what has come up. So these are all graphs, and for each, you don't have to take a look at each one individually, but generally speaking, each of these graphs, up is good, down is bad. And the last fiscal year is what you see on the right here. So each of these metrics that I talked about is being mapped here as the last dot on the graph. And they met every one of their targets for each of these metrics. But if you take a look at the trends over the past 5 years, almost all of them was going down, except for debt service coverage. So with operating ratio going down, getting closer and closer to 1.0, and eventually could be going down below 1, with days cash on hand declining. They used to have days cash on hand that exceeded 250 days. Now they're 140 something. Their quick ratio kind of fluctuated quite a bit. Looking at trends is really important because it tells you whether or not just this past fiscal year how you did, but over time, how have you been doing? And does this fiscal year compare well or poorly compared to the others? And are you trending in a good direction or a poor direction? So in this case, I would advise the utility to consider adjusting, to either find ways to adjust their expenses or to generate more revenues, because if things continue at this trend, then in not the far future, they will not look so well on their financial metrics, and their revenues might not be enough to pay for all their expenses. If you're looking for some help to do all of these kind of calculations, we have a tool, an Excel spreadsheet that you can download and use. And that spreadsheet you can download from our website, or if you just, I think if you just search for financial health checkup for water utilities and maybe put EFC there, you can find it through Bing or Google. And this spreadsheet is a pretty simple spreadsheet. It walks you through how to read your financial statements and then asks you to literally just copy and paste numbers straight from your audited statements into the spreadsheet, into each of these cells. And when you do that and you specify what targets you want to have, it creates these graphs for you, the past 5 years and how you're trending in those 5 years. So it communicates not just the last fiscal year, which it does do that, but it also shows you the 5-year trends. So it's a free download, and you can use that for your own purposes. So with financial metrics, it's one thing to measure them, to assess them, to track them. That's really important because it shows you over time how you're doing and whether or not you're performing well. Your enterprise fund is financially sustainable. It's also another thing to set targets and to have the board actually consider and approve specific targets, because then that influences your budgeting and influences how you manage your system. This isn't something that all utilities do, but it is something that many utilities do either formally or informally. Formally meaning that the board has actually specified and said, we want you as an enterprise fund to always have days cash on hand above 180. We want you to have a debt service coverage ratio that's above 1.5. So they have a specific written document that says we want performance metrics to be XYZ, and the utility manager or the finance director or the town manager will communicate with their board every year on how they're doing against those targets. That's the formal way. The informal way is you might not have the board's written document or written policy about what those targets are, but you have an understanding of what they're looking for, or even you as the utility staff and managers have your own targets that you're trying to achieve. But either way, having some kind of a target and trying to make sure that your metrics are always exceeding those targets is one way to manage your system, make sure that your enterprise fund can be self-sufficient, at least in meeting the targets that you've set. If you want to know a little more about setting targets, you feel free to take a look at a previous recorded webinar that we did. We had some speakers from a couple of utilities talk about setting financial targets and how they meet them, or how they monitor and meet them. So I think it's a 1-hour webinar that you can watch later on. I'll show you some examples just quickly of what types of metrics we've seen. So we've tried to track some of the utilities and see what targets they've set for themselves. We've seen targets, a lot of utilities focus mostly on the reserves, to have some kind of a minimum reserves target or a minimum days cash on hand target. Of course, everybody has, if you've got debt service, then you have a debt service coverage ratio baked into your bond covenants anyway. But some utilities choose to go above and beyond that. So even if the bond covenants require a 1.1 or 1.2 debt service coverage ratio, some utilities have chosen to put into their financial targets to always have higher than 1.5 or even 2.0 as their debt service coverage ratio. And the reason they do that, going above and beyond the bond covenants, is because the higher this ratio, the better they get rated if they go through credit rating agencies. And the higher your rating, the lower your interest rates are going to be on future bonds as well. So they actually target and they generate higher ratios to make sure that future capital expenses and future debt service, they could benefit from lower interest rates going forward as well. There are additional things that some utilities choose to put in as financial targets, including things like rates affordability, or even something as simple as we want to make sure our target is that we are either a AAA rated or AA rated utility. So these are more common for larger utilities. This is it's a busy slide, and I don't intend to go through each one of these, but it gives you an idea of some of the examples that we've seen. This is from work that we did back in 2014, but it really doesn't. The numbers might change here and there, but the idea hasn't really changed much. This is what it looks like if utilities choose to have specific financial targets. An easy example is days cash on hand. We want to have 180 days. Or a different way of looking at it is they want to have an operating reserve fund that has a minimum fund balance of at least 90 days of annual O&M expenditures. So it's instead of 180, it's 90 days of O&M expenditures, or it might be 180 days, or it might be 365. There are also targets for capital reserve funds. So they want a capital reserve fund that's at least equivalent to 25% or more of their annual capital expenditures. So they want to make sure that at the end of the year, they still have a quarter, if not more, of their annual capital expenditures in their fund balance. They never dip lower than that. You've got some other examples regarding affordability and increases in rates. On debt service, there's a lot of metrics that come around debt specifically. A lot of utilities would have debt service levels or debt load metrics to try to balance how you're paying for your system. So how much debt do you want to use to fund your replacement and rehabilitation and all of your infrastructure costs versus cash? So some systems actually put that as a target, say we want to have debt service that doesn't exceed a specific portion of our either our total revenues or our annual expenditures for capital projects. And targets should be customized for each utility. So don't take a look at this and just copy what you see here. First of all, this is not from one utility. So no one utility is trying to do everything that I'm just showing here as specified. These are actually from a bunch of different utilities, and this is just different examples. But you should set your own targets based on your conditions and based on what your governing board wants you to do with your enterprise fund. So really the decisions need to be coming through them. You might be recommending some targets and communicating some targets, but the board needs to tell you what they want of your enterprise fund. I'm going to pause here because we're about to switch over now and start talking about benchmarking rates. I don't see any questions submitted. Let me just double check that. So I'm going to continue on with the presentation, but if you have any questions about financial benchmarking, now is a really good time to put it into the questions box. Because now I'm going to start switching over and talking about comparing rates and benchmarking rates. Actually, before I do that, I have a question for Amanda, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, and if you don't know the answer to that, feel free to defer at this time. But with GEFA, with the loans that you provide to water and wastewater systems in Georgia, do you have a specific debt service coverage ratio that you require the systems to achieve? Do you know that off the top of your head, or is that something that we should follow up on later on?
No, I actually do know it off the top of my head. We require a minimum of 1.05.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So that's actually, so yeah, I was talking about 1.1 and 1.2. If you go to the commercial bond market, you might see something like that with GEFA. The requirements are even a little bit lower. It's 1.05, so you need the extra 5% in addition to your operations, maintenance, and debt service costs as security towards those funds. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, so let's talk about benchmarking rates. And I'll start off with a poll, just to give myself a little bit of a break. Oops, I think I closed it. Never mind. I was going to ask, I apologize. I hit the button too quickly and I don't think I could reopen it. So I'm going to go back to just sharing the screen. I was going to ask whether or not you consider comparing your water rates to other utilities rates to be an important process or important thing for you to do. And I'm not going to ask that now, obviously, but I will say that we do know that comparing rates is very, very common, and it is something that usually stems from communications between the utility staff with the boards. So with elected officials or even appointed officials who are on the governing bodies, there's always discussion about how do our rates compare. How do our rates, are our rates affordable to our customers is one question. The other question is, how do our rates compare to our neighboring towns or to similar towns? Because there seems to be a need for some decision makers to make sure that your utility is not an outlier, that you're not charging something that's excessively high or excessively different than everybody else. And this is something that was corroborated through a survey that we did a few years ago. Again, this was a national survey, so it was not just Georgia. But we did a survey with the Water Research Foundation asking elected officials as well as utility managers about communications between the elected officials and the person from the utility that was proposing a rate increase, a water or wastewater rate increase. And what we found was that of the 1,400 utilities, about 94% shared information about the utility's financial condition whenever they were asking for a rate increase, which is not surprising. If you're going to ask for a rate increase, you should at least communicate how well your enterprise fund is doing. And 74% was or shared how neighboring utilities, how your rates compare to neighboring utilities, as well as about half of them were comparing their rates to similar size utilities. And that information was judged by the staff to be very useful or somewhat useful in communicating to elected officials. So they not only shared this information, but they shared it, and they thought that the act of sharing this information was helpful to the elected officials they were talking to. And about 62% of the utilities compared the rates to either neighboring utilities, either as part of an internal process prior to presenting rate case. So even if they don't present that information to the governing board, a lot of utilities, about almost 2/3 of the utilities nationally, do some kind of a comparison internally as you're setting rates, as you're looking at your budgets, to do benchmarking essentially. On the elected official side, we asked them, we did a survey for them, asking them what information they cared about when the utility was asking them for a rate increase. And this is what they said was very important or important. Long-term impact on the utility's financial condition. So if you're going to ask for a rate increase, tell me how that's going to affect our enterprise fund going forward. Why is it important for our enterprise fund? Almost everybody said that's very important or important. Half of the elected officials that we surveyed said what neighboring utilities are charging was very important or important. And almost the same amount said how similar size utilities. So half the elected officials said that benchmarking our rates to other utilities rates was important information for them. And almost everybody said we need to know also whether the rates you're proposing are going to be affordable for our residential customers. When utilities compare rates and benchmark rates, it's often becomes sort of like a source of pride thing if your rates are lower than everybody else. So with this communication with the governing body, you might be comparing your rates, and if your rates are lower than others, you might see, you know, press releases that or on websites you might see utilities, you know, somewhat bragging about having lower rates than everybody else, and that's a source of pride for the community. That's fine, but I'll come back to that. And the common way of comparing grades and benchmarking grades is something similar to this, where you call up or you ask utilities or you find from other sources what other utilities are charging, and you put it into a graph that shows here are all the different charges, they ranked from highest to lowest, and you communicate. We know a lot of utilities communicate sort of a graph like this to their governing board. Well, if you do that, and this is an example from North Carolina, but it's similar cases everywhere, including Georgia. And if you're, for example, a town of 4 Oaks, then you look great on this chart because you're lower than everybody else that's on your left here. But if you're providing this graph to your governing board and you're Chatham County, and you're showing up as the second most expensive rate to everybody else, then the communication then switches gears and focuses more on why are our rates higher than everybody else, and let's lower our rates or let's not have any more rate increases. So it influences future rate increases. If all you're doing right now is just showing how our rates compare to everybody else, that's not going to be a very helpful tool when you're communicating with your governing board. And there are, you know, the problems with benchmarking this way is typically that you might be comparing to utilities that are not same to you. They have different cost structures. They might be a large town, a large city with a big customer base, and they will have lower rates than your system that might be for a small town, and you don't have the same economies of scale. So not comparing to similar type utilities, not comparing to similar size utilities, comparing to only 4 or 5 utilities is another problem, because that doesn't give you enough information to do benchmarking appropriately. And if you're only comparing for either a one consumption point or you're only comparing rates, then again, it goes back to, well, if you're comparing our rates, we want to make sure our rates are lower than everybody else. That's the story. It doesn't convey the rest of the information that's important. How's our enterprise fund financially? Are we performing well financially? It ignores the customer's ability to pay. So if you have high rates, but you're in a wealthy community, then that's not going to be the same problem than if you have really high rates and a community with lower income. So it doesn't convey all the messages and all the information you need to be conveying to your governing board as well as to your customers. So we've been doing, Amanda mentioned earlier that we've been doing rate surveys in Georgia, and the last rate survey was conducted was last year, 2019. And in that survey, we had about 520 utilities participating, which is 97% of all utilities in Georgia. So really, thank you everybody for participating on the survey and providing us your rate sheets. And you were included in the survey and included in the reports and the tools and the dashboards that we'll get to in a minute. The survey included information about water, wastewater, as well as irrigation, residential irrigation rates. We looked at your residential rates, your commercial rates. We looked at your rates that are inside and outside city limits. We looked at rates for all consumption points, not just one particular point. And we had, we created a summary report that I think we have a link to it in one of the later slides, as well as tables and data that you can download. So we have tables of every single utility's rates and all the rate structure details that you can download and use if you want to go through all the numbers yourself. And we put everything into the dashboards, which you can access all of this information by going to this one link. So if you go to efcsog.unc.edu/GA rates, you'll find access to all the information I'm talking about here. And the survey was conducted with partners as well. So we appreciate all the partnering organizations from Georgia that help spread the word and get participation in the survey. The way the survey was done is that we contacted all the utilities in the state, and the utilities provided a copy of the rate sheets. And we again thank you for doing that. We've been doing this since 2007, so I think it's some of you who have been in your positions longer probably have been contacted several times now. So those rate sheets came in, and we deciphered what the rates are from your rate sheets. We combined them with information about your communities from Census Bureau. We combined information from EPA's database, from CIDWIS. We looked at your financial statements from that was within the Department of Community Affairs. So we got your audited statements, some of the data from audited statements that way, and combined it from other data sources, put them all together into these tables, and provided the reports. And this is just a screenshot from that report that looks at trends in rates. Just want to let you know, this is not surprising, and it's not unique to Georgia, that water rates in Georgia have been in recent past been going up faster than inflation. That's been true for almost every state that we've tracked rate increases for, and it's very common to see water rates going up much faster than inflation. But keeping that in mind, more and more affordability becomes a problem. So as rates continue to go up because expenses continue to go up, there's going to be a bigger subset of your customer base that might have a harder time paying those bills. So we do a lot of discussions, a lot of webinars, and a lot of advising on how to help customers who can't pay their bills. Not the purpose of this webinar, though. And then we put everything together into a dashboard, which is an interactive dashboard, which you can access from these links. I think you might be able to access it from GEFA's website. I haven't double checked recently, but or you can just Google search it or Bing search it. If you just type in Georgia Water and Wastewater Rates Dashboard, you'll find it. Again, the data that's in there right now is from last year. So these are rates as of July 2019, not 2020. But you can use it to still be able to do your comparisons and benchmarking. And I'm going to switch, actually, I'm going to try my hand at the poll one more time. Great. So I want to ask how familiar you are with this dashboard. Have you used it before? You know everything about it? That's great, very familiar. You're somewhat familiar, but you want to hear a little bit more about it because you might learn something new. Or this might be your first time using it or knowing anything about it. So this will help me understand just how much in detail I should go into some of the details of the dashboard. The dashboard has been it's been active. I think we've been doing dashboards since 2007, 2008. So we've had an iteration of this type of dashboard for a while for Georgia, and we've been updating it with new rates data. But we know there's a lot of turnover at local government, so some of you might be new to the dashboard, and I'm happy to talk about it. All right, thank you. Just real quick, most of you seem to be not at all familiar or somewhat familiar, but could use a refresher. So I will go into details. And if I don't cover something, or if you have some more questions later on, feel free to reach out to us at the EFC, and you'll have my contact information again in the end. And we can walk you through the dashboard and talk about how your particular utility looks on the dashboard and what the results mean for you. So I'm going to stop this and share my screen. So if you go to the links, it will take you to a page. Actually, it will take you to this page right here. And so this is the start of the dashboard. If you scroll down, click on OK. What you'll see here is, let me zoom out just real quick. We have a dashboard that has all this information that was combined from last year. And what you hopefully automatically see are a couple of things. One is map of Georgia with a lot of blue dots. Each one of these blue dots represents a utility that's in the database. And then you've got 4 dials on your right, and the dials have red, greens, and yellows. And not surprisingly, greens are either good or within the range of comparison, and reds are things that are of caution. The darker the reds, the more cautious you have to be with it. Yellows would be something to just pay attention to. And I'll get into each one of these individually, but I just want to give you kind of a faraway snapshot, and I'll zoom in to just make it a little bit easier to see during the webinar. All right, so the first thing you need to do is to start off here at the very top where it says Abbeville. It's just the first one alphabetically listed, but search for your utility and click on it, and it will automatically update all the data and will show you as a red dot on the map. So I just happened to pick Athens Clark. I don't know why. I just picked that. I can just scroll and pick anything randomly. So let's look at Cairo, which is in the southern part of Georgia. So you click on the utility and it shows you who you are, and all the blue dots are, the dark blue dots are the ones you're being compared to right now. You can look at the water bill for Cairo, you can look at the sewer bill, or you can look at water and sewer combined. Let's keep it combined. And then it starts off by default showing you what the bill is at 5,000 gallons. This is the residential. So the dashboard focuses on residential rates. And if you have inside and outside rates, it focuses on the inside rates that you have for residential customers. So this is a water and sewer bill for 5,000 gallons a month. Cairo is charging $54, or was charging $54.95 every month. If you want to look at different consumption point, let's say you know that your average consumption is closer to 3,000 gallons. You can use a slider to adjust the consumption point, and it will recalculate what the bill is in all the comparisons. You can go anywhere from 0 gallons, which is basically your minimum charge or your base charge, and see how your base charge compares to everybody else, all the way up to 15,000 gallons, which is really high for residential customers. Typically, that would include some kind of irrigation or maybe a leak. But most utilities, I think, would probably aim to start off looking at the average bill, which let's say it's 5,000 gallons, which is the default. So Cairo's water and wastewater bill is $54.95, and you can see that compared to an average electric bill for that community in Georgia, it's about $148 a month. So water and sewer bill, even though $54 might sound high, compared to electric bill, it's not. It's still lower, and I think most communities will find that the water and sewer bill is lower than the electric bill. Still, we are catching up though. Water and sewer rates are going up faster than electric rates are. So it's not saying that eventually catch up, but it's getting closer. The gap is narrowing. The comparison is up here on the right. So this dial, the bill comparison dial, is showing Cairo's rates, which is $54.95. and how that compares to all these other dark blue dots. Light blue dots means they're in the database, but they don't have data. So in this case, they might be a water-only utility or a sewer-only utility, but they don't have a water and wastewater bill. So light blue means you're not comparing against them. Dark blue, you're comparing against. And you can see here that it tells you how many utilities you're being compared to. So Cairo is comparing against 371 other rate sheets or other rate structures across Georgia for water and sewer bill. With each of these dials, if you click on the blue question mark, a box shows up with explanation for this dial and what the colors mean. And sometimes it will also provide you some more information. So this dial, for example, includes some of the census data for the town of Cairo or the city of Cairo. And it will show you what the median household income is. So some of the raw data shows up in these blue question marks too. So the bill comparison dial, it's showing that this bill is somewhere here in the middle. Hopefully you see that there's a dark green area in the middle surrounded by a lighter green area, and then a small yellow area at the very left and a small yellow area at the very right. If your bill, I'm going to click away from there. If your needle is pointing somewhere in the dark green area, then you are charging rates that's in the middle 50% of all these dark blue dots. So you're in the middle, basically it's the interquartile, between the 25th and the 75th percentile, the middle majority. If your needle comes down to this light yellow area at the very front, that means that you're charging less than 90% of all the dark blue dots that you see on the map. And if you're charging at the high yellow area, then you're charging more than 90% of all the other utilities that you're being compared to. The reason why we chose to show you the middle 50% is because we don't want to have, benchmarking and aiming towards the bottom, or providing a target where you're always trying to achieve the lowest rate is not generally going to be the most sustainable, financially sustainable approach for your enterprise fund. If you're in the middle 50%, you can communicate that your charges are similar to the majority that are charging similar to you. The majority of utilities are same as you. If your rates are lower than 90% of the other communities, you may or may not be charging too little, and that might be affecting your financial performance for your enterprise funds. If you're charging on the high side, if you're charging higher than 90% of the utilities, then maybe you should just take a look and make sure that your rates are justified. So we're not showing that low area and the high area are bad. They're not red. That just means, take a look and make sure that the rates that you're charging are appropriate for your utility. Because if you're lower than 90%, then either your expenses are much lower, or your financial performance might be suffering because of it. Before I talk about comparing with financial performance, I mentioned that you're being compared to the middle 50%. With this drop-down option here, you can select and choose who you're comparing yourself to. So right now it starts off by default, you're comparing against everybody that we have in the database that had 2019 rates. If you compare only to similar size utilities, so you choose a comparison group of similar number of accounts, you can see the number of dark blue dots decreased. You only compare against 74 utilities because we identify that Cairo has somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 accounts, and we're going to be comparing Cairo's rates to only utilities that have between 3,000 and 10,000 accounts. So similar size utilities, and you can see all of a sudden now their rates actually look to be lower than 75% of similar size utilities. So their rates are actually lower than the majority of same utility size. You could also look at comparison groups of similar revenue generation, which gives you, again, similar type of size comparison. You can look at by water source. So if your Cairo is a groundwater system, you can compare only to groundwater systems, because groundwater costs are typically lower than surface water costs. You can compare yourself to other utilities that have the same rate structure type. So I think Cairo has an increasing block rate structure, so you only compare your rates against other utilities that have an increasing block rate structure, or same customer income. So Cairo median household income is somewhere between 30 and 35,000. So compare against other communities that have same kind of income as well. And you can see with each of these, the dials at the top two dials automatically change because the colors and the benchmarks around them will change based on who you're being compared to. If you're concerned about your neighboring towns, you can select to compare against utilities within 50 miles or 100 miles. If something is grayed out, it means that it does not provide you enough data points to compare to. So you can only compare against specific groups if you end up with at least 10 utilities to be compared to. So there's always a minimum of 10 that you're being compared to. Let me stick to just the same size accounts. So that's one dial. The next dial is, I'm going to skip this one right here. I'm going to focus on this one, cost recovery. So this was providing you that operating ratio that we talked about, including depreciation. The data is coming from DCA, Department of Community Affairs. And as much as possible, I think DCA has been, tries to include depreciation in the operating expenses. But we do know that sometimes local governments that report their data to DCA might sometimes exclude depreciation when they're putting their operating expenses. So I would double check to see whether or not the numbers that are being reported here. So if you click on the question mark, it shows you for audit statements for fiscal year 17, which is the latest available at the time the dashboard was created. The revenues that were being reported was 3 million. The expenses, we think, including depreciation, was 2.5 million. But if your audited statements show you that it's a little bit different, then just keep that in mind. that sometimes depreciation is actually excluded by mistake. It should actually be included. And the ratio, the targets, we said less than 1.0 is not a good sign. And I talked about maybe aiming for higher than 1, aiming for a 1.2 or more. So the green area starts at 1.2 and higher. So if you pick, I don't know if I can pick, just let me see what Abbeville falls in that category. Yeah. So with Abbeville, for example, their rates for water and wastewater combined is $29 a month for 5,000 gallons, which is lower than 90% of the utilities of the same size. Again, that might sound great to the governing boards, but if you look at their operating ratio, they are suffering because of it. Their operating ratio is 0.78, and if you take a look, they generated $383,000 from revenues, but their operating expenses was about $490 in a year. So the story now changes automatically from just, look, we have the lowest rates, so that's great, to we have low rates, but our finances are not doing so well. Perhaps we should consider an increase in the rates to improve the financial sustainability of our enterprise funds. The next two dials, this one here, top right one, is showing you what a conservation signal is, or what the price is that you're charging per 1,000 gallons above 10,000 gallons. So for residential customers using more than 10,000, they're going from 10 to 11,000. That's typically more likely that they're using that extra 1,000 gallons for irrigation or some discretionary use. It's rare that you need that for indoor usage. So what's the price that they're charging? Well, for Abbeville, they're charging $4 per 1,000 gallons for water and sewer combined above 10,000. So it's $4 per 1,000 gallons, which is lower than 75%. This dial is actually showing you the middle, sorry, we're showing you the different quartiles. So the highest 25%, the lowest 25%. The higher the rate that you're charging, the more of a conservation price signal you're giving your customer. You're telling your customer, that's fine if you want to use higher consumption, but we're going to be charging you much higher for it, and it incentivizes the customer to try to reduce or try to be efficient in their water usage. So if you're on the high side, that's what you're communicating. The last dial is median affordability, which is taking a look at that's $29 a month and comparing it to the median household income for your community. And it's computing that percent MHI that some of you are familiar with. In this case, it's 1.67. So even though the bills are low, that $29 amounts to 1.67% of the annual income of the household that has the median income or the middle income for their community. Half the community would be spending more than 1.67, and half the community will be spending less than 1.67% if everybody's using 5,000 gallons, which is not the case, but that's what this metric is computing. This is the metric that's being used to assess eligibility criteria for some of the grants and low interest loans that are available for utilities. So take a look at this metric. If you're looking at affordability, there's a lot of other tools that you can use to assess affordability in more detail, including, so if you click on this question box and click on the rates residential affordability assessment tool, it's a spreadsheet that you could use, and it computes multiple metrics that you could use to assess whether or not your rates are affordable for your residential customers. That goes beyond percent MHI, because percent MHI is very limited, and it's a little bit flawed in assessing affordability. It's good for assessing eligibility for grants and loans, but it's not so great in terms of giving the full picture of whether or not your rates are affordable to your customers. The last thing I'll mention here is, at least on this screen, is that you could raise your rates. Let me zoom out just a quick second. If you raise your rates by, let's say, I'm going to 10%, then you can see the needles start moving a little bit. So it's modeling what that increase will be. So with a 10% increase, they go from $29 to $31.90. They go from $4 to $4.40 per thousand. Their operating ratio will theoretically would go from whatever it was, 0.7 something to 0.84. So it maybe not enough of an increase. Now, this is a good tool to use to get a very quick understanding of the types of rate increases you might need to adjust for cost recovery and how that might affect affordability, but it does not take place of your rate study. You need to still be able to do your analysis, to look at your budgets, to look at your expenses, and to charge rates appropriately. And we have other tools that can help you look at your rates more specifically, but this is just a very quick way to just simulate what a rate increase might do to your enterprise fund and to your affordability metrics. So even when they go up 21%, they're still in the lower 10% compared to other utilities. You can click on the download data button, and what this will show you is a screenshot of all the data that's being displayed at that point in time. So everything that's being displayed here, you can see right now from the download data. If you really want everybody's rates, then I would suggest going to the tables. If you click on links, we provide links to a lot of different things. The very first link is a copy or it takes you to that webpage that I mentioned earlier that has the tables of all the utilities rates, as well as the reports and some other resources that are available for you to use. If you click on characteristics, there's some information that just gives you a little bit more data about the census information for Abbeville and how it compares to other utilities in the database as well. So I'm going to stop here. And I know we're just about at time right now. I'm going to check and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, we will, I'll wrap things up right now. So I don't see any questions. Feel free to submit. Oh, let's see. There's a question submitted. Why does the dashboard reference the average electric bill? Sometimes it's been helpful to communicate with the governing boards how water and sewer bills compare to other types of enterprises or other types of bills that a customer would pay. Because if you're going to the governing board and you're talking about going from $50 water and sewer bill to $55 water and sewer bill, and there's some hesitation about a $5 increase or a 10% increase, sometimes communicating that, you know what, we're talking about $5 here, and when you're looking at electric bills or you're looking at other types of bills, that water and sewer is still a smaller portion, but it's still a very, very important service. It might help communicate the value of the service you're providing, and also relatively the relatively lower price that we're talking about. So it just puts things into a little bit perspective in terms of, are these rates high or low? Well, if you look at electricity, which is also an important service, electricity is charging a lot higher, and they're fighting their own battles too. But water and sewer rates typically are not quite as high as that. Sometimes we've added actually cable bills, which is a more discretionary type of charge as well. So sometimes utilities would try to do these kind of comparisons. Other questions? All right, no other questions so far, but submit them if you have any more. These slides actually have a bunch of more information that just kind of goes through everything I just went through the demo. I think I'm sharing screen. Yes. So feel free to take a look. These are just kind of visual reminders of things when you download the PowerPoint slide deck. And then I'll end with saying that there are a lot of resources that we have at the EFC that we could that you could use for financial decision making. If you want to know about some funding, what's available for as far as funding for capital projects, we have funding tables you can access. We'll talk about them a little bit more tomorrow. These are the tools that you can download. These are spreadsheet models that you can download to help you with decision making, including things like adjusting your rates or assessing how financially resilient your enterprise fund is right now, even with reductions in revenues that are happening because of COVID. So you could model like what's a 15% decrease in revenues and how many days cash on hand do we have available, and how long can we weather a 15% reduction in revenue because of COVID or some other situation. If you are a small water system and you basically if you're serving less than 10,000 people, we can work with you directly one-on-one and do some advising or use some of these tools and to advise you on some issues. Actually, I'm going to pull up right now the last poll, which is asking you if you're interested, if you're a small water system, or if you're working with a small water system, and you're interested in us contacting you to provide some advising or to work with you one-on-one on financial management of a system, just say yes here, and we'll follow up after this webinar. And just to kind of round things out, I still don't see any more questions. I'm happy to answer questions. After this webinar, you'll have my contact information in the last slide, but we can follow up with you if you have some more questions as well. All right, I'm going to close this poll. Thank you. And the types of assistance that we can provide are things like what you see on the screen, that we can review your rates, we can advise you on your rates, we can look at your financial performance, we could walk you through the dashboard and how you compare or how you show up on the dashboard. We could talk about affordability, asset management, capital improvement planning, a lot of things that we can do. If you're looking at partnerships with regionalization, we can offer some advice on that too. Here's my contact information. I apologize for going a little bit over on time, but thank you everybody for your attention. If you do have any questions, always feel free to contact me. I will follow up with folks that said yes to that last poll to schedule a time, either for me or for my colleagues, to schedule a time to communicate with you. And then Amanda, do you have anything that you want to say in closing remarks?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate everyone attending the webinar today. I hope it was very helpful. It was helpful for me. And if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to me as well.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And then as a reminder, tomorrow and on Thursday, we have 2 more webinars. Tomorrow's webinar is going to be focused on rate setting and especially focusing on capital planning and setting rates for capital projects. On Thursday, we'll be talking a little bit more about communications with elected officials as well as with your customers. So thank you everybody for your time, and hopefully I'll see many of you tomorrow.